Hello, in just a moment we've got the press preview for you as we take a look at the morning papers. First though, a reminder of our top stories here this evening. And Donald Trump says he could issue a new executive order as early as Monday after a court ruling blocked his controversial travel ban. The Defence Secretary says the investigation into abuse claims made against British Iraq war veterans will close in a few months' time. And a British woman who's thought to be the first to travel to Syria to join the fight against Islamic State has said she's willing to die in the battle. Hello there, you're watching Sky News and the press preview. Over the next half hour, we'll be seeing what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabby and the deputy political editor at the Sunday Express, Camilla Tominey. So hello to both of you.
Hello.
So let's check what's on those front pages then. And the Mail leads with the decision to close the investigation into allegations against Iraq war veterans, calling the move an end to the witch hunt. The Eye also goes with that story, reporting that the MOD has been accused of wasting public money. Stand-in doctors have been charging the NHS as much as £4,000 per day. That's the main story in The Times. The Telegraph leads with comments from the Apple boss, Tim Cook, who's described fake news as a big problem that is killing people's minds. Boris Johnson wrote to the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, urging him to continue weapons exports to Saudi Arabia after the bombing of a funeral in Yemen that killed 140 people. That's the lead in The Guardian. The Financial Times Weekend Edition reports that former Rolls-Royce executives have been questioned as part of a corruption investigation. The Express goes with the suggestion that the European Union could demand a £49 billion payment from the UK to leave the bloc. The Star claims that Tara Palmer-Tomkinson, who passed away on Wednesday, had wanted to become a mother. So let's talk about some of those front pages and some of the stories inside as well with Rachel Shabby and Camilla Tominey. And you've picked out the front page of The Guardian to kick off with. And this is the story, the main story there about Boris Johnson and weapons export. So what exactly are they saying?
Well, this is coming out in a judicial review of the decision to extend or to continue exporting arms to Saudi Arabia, which now it turns out Boris Johnson pushed for that to happen. And that is despite already really serious concerns about abuses of international humanitarian law. This is a war perpetrated by one of the wealthiest countries in the world, Saudi Arabia, against one of the poorest. At least 5,000 people, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 civilians have been killed. Boris Johnson approved this immediately after a funeral was blasted. 140 people were killed there. And the campaign against the arms trade has always said about Yemen and Saudi Arabia that it was quite clear that the abuses were systemic, that it's not a one-off, it's something that keeps happening, and that it would be, given that the UK is supplying arms to Saudi Arabia, there is a cause and effect there. So it's quite extraordinary for Boris Johnson to now be saying that he's satisfied that the abuses didn't happen, or that where they are happening, he's been given assurances that they won't happen again.
Well, that's right, because they're saying that they've got hold of a letter, haven't they, saying that Boris Johnson advised Liam Fox, who's the International Trade Secretary. He says, according to them, the issue is extremely finely balanced, but I judge at present that the Saudis appear committed both to improving processes and to taking action to address failures and individual incidents. And he says that Saudi Arabia had given Britain commitments in the aftermath of that airstrike that you were talking about on the funeral, which meant the clear risk threshold for refusal hasn't yet been reached. But so it sounds like he feels that it's a tough call.
I mean, he feels it's a tough call, but it just seems that most people who have examined this situation have concluded that it really isn't a close call. And interestingly, this is something that the British public as well find really distasteful. I think it's something like 60% don't think that we should still be exporting arms to Saudi Arabia, given what is happening in Yemen.
And yet Yemen, we don't see a huge amount of coverage because it is incredibly dangerous to get in there, isn't it, and report from the ground.
And also, I think with everything else going on in the news cycle, perhaps there isn't the appetite, and it's probably wrong, for stories about the Yemen versus other domestic and European, at the moment, affairs. In fact, Anglo-American affairs are dominating the news agenda. Having said that, it's difficult, isn't it? What's interesting about the wording of some of these letters, both from Johnson and indeed in reply from Liam Fox, who's the International Trade Secretary, is they aren't just making cut and dried decision and being bullish about it. To be fair, some of the couched language, you know, the Trade Secretary says to Johnson, I agree that this is an extremely complex situation, that the issue of clear risk is extremely finely balanced. He's saying, please give me regular updates on the situation in Yemen. Some of these decision-making, appreciate what you're saying, Rachel, about people probably disagreeing with Johnson's stance, but it doesn't look as if he's been weighing it up lightly. It looks as if he's put a great deal of thought into it. What people make of the conclusion will probably depend on their opinion of whether we are in Saudi Arabia's pocket for various different oil-related reasons.
And you talked about the fact that a lot of our news is dominated by Anglo-US issues, and we turn immediately to that on the other side of the front page of The Guardian. Trump planned to address Parliament abandoned. Of course, this controversial visit has had a lot of newspaper coverage, and the suggestion here that the issue of Donald Trump addressing the joint Houses of Parliament may now be off the agenda?
Well, there's been a bit of a kickback in the papers in general, with Trump's people, no doubt, briefing journalists and saying, well, he wasn't really bothered about addressing Parliament in the first place.
Didn't want to do it?
Didn't want to do it.
Doesn't want to meet the Queen even, does he?
No. I mean, he definitely wants to meet the Queen.
He does want to meet the Queen,
Definitely wants to meet the Queen.
I'm just waiting for him to back down on that.
And I think, yeah, he wants to go to Scotland and embrace his tartan roots and tee off at Balmoral and all sorts.
Have her watch him play golf.
Funny enough, she doesn't like golf at all.
Huh.
No, or tennis, weirdly, but I digress. Point is...
Although interesting.
Well, it's funny because Speaker John Bercow, of course, is a major tennis fan, but she's recently passed over some of her responsibilities for the LTA to the Duchess of Cambridge, who loves a little bit of tennis. Point is here is there's been huge debate in both political and royal stories about this state visit and when it's going to happen, with both sides, all sides, saying the visit hasn't been confirmed yet, so we can't give any details, but we know behind the scenes that the White House and Downing Street have been thrashing out Trump's demands versus what can be supplied and the timing of it all, and when the Queen's available to host, where will it be hosted. Traditionally, these visits always take part in London, and they involve an honour guard and lunch at Buckingham Palace, a state banquet in the evening, the Prince of Wales doing a bit of entertaining, which people have suggested could be a bit tricky, considering he disagrees with President Trump on a number of issues, including climate change and refugees. So the notion that it might be delayed will probably help them out from a diplomatic perspective, because having it in June, there's still this threat of protesters taking to the gates of Buckingham Palace and ruining the whole shebang, which is obviously meant to be smoothing the way to a free trade deal.
And someone suggested that it could even take place when Parliament is in recess, which would avoid embarrassment on all sides. So who knows which direction this will take us. But let's move on to Inside the Times, because obviously John Bercow has been in the news connected with that potential address to Parliament, having spoken out against it. But this article is suggesting that despite some anger amongst some in the Tory party about his speaking out, he hopes for 2 more years.
Yeah, there's been anger about him speaking out against Donald Trump speaking in Parliament. He said that he shouldn't be welcome to speak in Parliament because of his sexist and racist views, and it seemed that upset a few Conservative MPs, although it also seems that quite a lot of Conservative MPs quite like him. They think he's got a firm hand. He tells people to sit down and shut up when they should be told that. You know, he has a sense of humour. It seems that he is quite popular within the realms of his job to some extent.
I think there's a sense that people, regardless of whether they agreed with him or not about Trump being a racist and a sexist, it's whether they agree that he should have expressed such partisan opinions.
It's not partisan, though. That's the thing about this, is that saying someone is racist and sexist is not a political view. It's a value-neutral statement. These are rights, these are values above politics. It's not a political sentiment.
To be fair, though, Bercow has historically expressed views that are in line with his own thinking. I'm thinking back to the Diamond Jubilee, where he gave this rather strange address to the Queen. calling her the kaleidoscope queen, and it was actually a veiled reference to his work with the LGBT community. So there's a sense of, is Bercow making his own political points for his own future career gain, perhaps? I mean, he's not going to be Speaker forever. We know he has quite lofty ambitions. He does have a reputation, on one hand, of having some cross-party support, and on the other hand, a lot of cross-party suspicion that he's basically, you know, using his position of great influence and power to his own ends.
He would be the first person in Parliament to do that.
Well, he wouldn't be, but that doesn't make it right.
It doesn't make it right.
Some people don't agree that. I mean, I know that's your opinion of Trump, but people think that it was inappropriate for him to have voiced that personal opinion when really he should be remaining neutral. And it is for him to decide who speaks and who doesn't. But the invitation hadn't even gone out yet.
OK, shall we squeeze in? We've got about a minute. We can squeeze in one more story before we go. And you've actually picked out a correction, is that right?
Well, it sounds weird to pick out a correction, but this is the coverage of Tara Palmer Tompkinson, which is all over the newspapers and perhaps surprised people with how much has been written.
After her surprise death
this week. And the Mail here obviously got an interview with her and put it into the Weekend magazine that's coming out tomorrow, but weren't able to pull it. So in this interview, she apparently just talks about, you know, her joy and life and hopes for the future. And they point out that while it might be upsetting for her family, it wasn't able to be pulled because it had already gone to press. And we were just discussing the fact that actually everyone else has made comment about her this week, and there's been a huge amount of coverage of her well-documented drug problems. Something quite nice about the fact that she's actually had the final say. I don't know whether the family will agree with that, but that she's had some control over her own obituary in a really weird way. It's just, we pointed it out because it was a really unusual clarification to see, and what people might make of it when they see the coverage tomorrow remains to be seen too.
Yeah, and very poignant, no doubt. OK, we're gonna take a break now. We've got plenty lined up for you after the break, including Jeremy Hunt admits that care in some hospitals is completely unacceptable, according to a report in the Daily Mail. That and more coming up. Welcome back to the press preview, where we're taking a look at the papers with Rachel Shabby and Camilla Tominey. And we're going to talk about the health service, because the Mail, page 2 of the Mail, is talking about Jeremy Hunt in an interview describing the care in some hospitals as being completely unacceptable, they say here.
Yeah, this is Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt stating the obvious and stating what health officials, trusts, bodies, the NHS, doctors, nurses, anyone who has anything to do with the NHS has been telling him for months, if not years on end, which is that there is a crisis in the NHS. He's saying that hospitals, the level of care is completely unacceptable, quote, and says no one would want it for members of their own family. Is absolutely right.
He says in some hospitals, doesn't he?
It's terrifying, you know, when you think of like a family member getting ill and what would await them at the NHS, which is failing its targets on A&E, has a really bad track record for cancer care at the moment, has a shortage of hospital beds, has people waiting and in some cases dying in corridors awaiting treatment. And, you know, I think a lot of people will be quite annoyed with Jeremy Hunt for saying this, given that, you know, he runs the department that they will be blaming for a lot of this.
Do you know what? I think some people might have sympathy with the fact that it doesn't matter who runs the department and who's in government. The NHS has got a chronic problem. It's become chronic. The whole situation with the management of the NHS, its ability to cope with increasingly complex patient needs, patient responsibility now compared to 1945 when it was set up. I think that it has just overly become this political football that on one hand Labour say it needs more funding, and then the Tories say we've never given it more funding and nothing's changed. You know, it's...
But I think that's a little bit unfair,
totally
Camilla. I mean, a lot of it
reorganising.
is to do with cuts in social care, and most doctors will say, you cut social care, you're going to put an extra...
How do you square the circle that it's never had more money? It's never had more money, Rachel, and yet it's still in problems.
Well,
how
you
do you
can
square that
by the
circle?
fact that the population has changed.
It's not just population, though, isn't it? It needs root and branch reorganisation.
I mean,
Is it feasible to have a system that was invented in 1945, still serving the original aims and purposes. I mean, look at Ireland. In Ireland, they charge people €40 to visit the doctor.
But the things you're talking about are a political decision. What you have just said, is it feasible? Now, we can make a decision, and we know how much the nation loves and supports the NHS. That means that we need to fund it more. It's really that simple.
But how do you square the circle? It's never had more funding, and yet it's still in crisis.
Well, I've just said, because it's
so you want to throw more money at it, but doing
I think,
what?
You know,
exactly?
people have already said they'd be prepared to pay more in tax if that money was directly funneled into the NHS. It's quite clear that there is a public support for increased funding of the NHS, and yet we have a government that doesn't want to do that.
Maybe, but maybe people voted Brexit because they wanted the money from the European Union to go to it. If it wasn't 350 million, it's still what, 9 billion a year.
They did vote for Brexit because of that. As it turns out, it turned out to be a lie.
Well, no, the figure was wrong, but money may well go from the. What, that you don't think we're going to save money from leaving the EU?
That I don't think 350 million...
regardless of the figure,
no, that bit was... It's not a regardless, that's the central basis of the lie.
Does the NHS need, rather than more money simply being thrown at it for political capital, total root and branch reorganisation, so that it is in keeping with people's different changing needs? Also, do patients actually need to take more responsibility for their own health, the consequences of bad health decisions, and the own burden they place on the NHS? You say, like, the NHS, I've had great experiences with the NHS. People still continue to do. 850 people on trolleys for more than 12 hours is far too many. But to castigate the whole of the NHS as
look, the NHS does an amazing job against the odds. The NHS is staffed by amazing, dedicated people who are working against the odds to deliver the fantastic service that you and I and lots of other people enjoy. That doesn't mean it's not in crisis. Those two things can be true at the same time.
OK, I think we're not going to be able to solve this in a very short amount of time I'm giving you, but it is a debate that will rumble on and on, isn't it? So let's turn our attention very quickly, try and get a few more stories in. This is inside the Daily Mail. Now, estate agents make buyers pay £1,000 reservation fee for taking
Seems a bit
off the
suspect.
market. So what's the argument behind that?
Obviously, we've got supply and demand problems, so people are desperate to get homes. And this is a notion that estate agents are saying to them, OK, well, if you make an offer and you want it to be accepted, then maybe give us £1,000 and we'll make sure that the sale goes through between exchange and completion. But some of the people that are giving over this money are saying, well, hang on, what if the survey reveals that there's structural problems and we want to pull out? Oh, well, sorry, you'll lose your deposit, which to me just sounds like extortion.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Mail has a test case of exactly that, with a couple who paid the fee after they put in an offer on a property that then turned out to have to require
a new
roof repairs, £10,000, and they couldn't get this fee back. So, you know, this is actually happening. There's a case of it happening. It just seems like, you know, they're already not the most popular profession, are they? And this is not going to help.
OK, journalists more popular then.
More popular than estate agents.
Maybe, if with tactics like that. I know, terrible.
I've moved you on because I want to find out why we're going from cold to hot as far as television is concerned.
Sara Lund there with her Nordic jumper on.
From The Killing.
From The Killing. Nordic noir in general has been massive, we'll all agree, over the last few years. But apparently steamy, sexy thrillers are coming back in. From Chile and other exotic climes, apparently. And I'm wondering whether this has been started by Apple Tree Yard, which was on last week, which was basically this kind of steamy thriller involving middle-aged sex.
Which we're all now going to watch.
But I've advised her to watch it on Catch Up because it was very good and Emily Watson was in it. And why shouldn't we have more programmes depicting older ladies enjoying sex as opposed to just nubile 20-somethings?
I think we'll leave it on that note. Steamy Sundays ahead. Camilla and Rachel, lovely to see you. Thanks both very much indeed.